Next up is David Pilliod. David is a supervisory research ecologist in forest and rangeland ecosystems at the USGS in Boise, Idaho. And his research focuses on the ecology, restoration, and conservation of aquatic and terrestrial systems, and he's particularly interested in working with agencies to improve monitoring data and to use those data to answer questions regarding the effects and effectiveness of land management, resource management, and restoration actions.
All right, great. Thank you. And thank you, Troy, for giving a nice preview of some of the material I'm going to talk about today, which is this idea of herbaceous biomass and how precipitation influences that, which can lead to fire, but also looking at how precipitation after fire events can influence post-fire restoration outcomes. And I want to acknowledge my two co-authors who are here today, Justin and Robert, who are sitting in the middle of the room. So it's no new news that the Great Basin is in a new fire regime. We have non-native annual grasses that have come into the Great Basin, have proliferated. Cheatgrass is certainly one of the most dominant ones of concern. And it's a fuel for fire, as we know. And what happens when you get into this cheatgrass fire cycle is you can get conversion from sagebrush stands like this to monocultures of cheatgrass, and that's going to perpetuate more fire. And this cheatgrass fire cycle has come finally to the forefront of concern at the national level, and Secretary Jewell signed the secretarial order, and I've put up there the highlight of the point to enhance policies and strategies for preventing and suppressing rangeland fire, and also for restoring sagebrush landscapes impacted by fire. So these are major national issues now that we, as agencies and as landowners, have to be, focusing on. The wildfire, across the western United States has been on the forefront for quite a while. We've seen presentations by Peter Brown showing that there's this period of fire suppression and probably favorable climate where there wasn't a lot of fire activity in the western United States, but that's really taken off since about 1980. If you look specifically at the Great Basin and you break that out by current vegetation type, as done here on the right, you can see that from 1980, which is right here, to 2009, you are getting more fires. This is in burned area. And you're getting more fires in cheatgrass, you're getting a larger area burned in sagebrush steppe, but you're also seeing that up in mountain shrub and pinyon juniper as well. So this led to a question that's been bugging us, which is how is precipitation really driving this wildfire occurrence? And more importantly, how is this precipitation influencing post-fire outcomes in Great Basin sagebrush steppe? So we proposed two hypotheses. The first, that wildfires are more likely after several years of above average precipitation. And this is because sagebrush steppe is a fuel limited system. And this isn't new science, but we wanted to confirm it for ourselves. And second, that the success of these post-fire seedings is dependent upon relative amount of precipitation in the years following fire. Both of these seem logical, right? So we looked at a fire data set. We compiled it across the Great Basin from 1950 to 2014, and we have about 9,500 fires we're looking at. And so I've broken those out here into large fires on the top, large fires over 1,000 acres. We use that cutoff because that's what the MTBS data set uses as large fires. And so you can see across these different potential vegetation types here, here's sagebrush steppe, predominant number of fires in sagebrush steppe and juniper, and then much less in salt desert scrub. Well, that's a particularly fuel limited system, and so you have fewer fires there, but still quite a lot. And then other vegetation types are just lumped out here together. So what we did is we took all of those 9,500 polygons and we put a centroid in the middle of them. And at this point, we calculated a few things. First, we wanted to know what is the precipitation at that point 5 years before that fire and 5 years after that fire, including the fire year. And we calculated this from PRISM data. So this was PRISM data that we had downloaded from 1900 to 2014, but we were just focused on that period from 1950 to present. We also calculated the average precipitation at that point, and then we looked at what we're calling proportion of normal, and you could consider it some proportion of average. We decided normal was more reasonable and conveyable. So what that is it's the precipitation in this year, T, over the average precipitation at that point. And if this is above 1, then it's kind of a wet year. And if it's below 1, then it's somewhat of a dry year. And that's an important metric that we'll use throughout the rest of the talk. What we did then was average those across all of our fires to give us some sense of what's going on in the landscape. So this is across those 9,500 fires, this is the average precipitation at the wildfire locations. So these different points that have burned in the Great Basin. And this is what it looks like. And first thing you'll notice, the one line's right there, it's almost never average. It's never typical, right? So we love using these terms like average and normal, but it's a rare event when you fall on that. Usually you're either dry or you're wet up here. And in fact, you can see that it bounces back and forth in somewhat of a, I wouldn't say predictable, but certainly a pattern. So let's overlay on that now the area burned. And so this is the hectares on the right as total hectares burned in each given year. And you can see that, much like I was showing you earlier, there wasn't a lot of fire activity up until about the 1980. And yes, some of this might be record keeping, but it certainly holds up when you look at the records that we were seeing from Peter Brown in the fire scar data. And then what you'll notice is that there's a couple of these cycles where you'll get these peaks of fire activity. And what we noticed here is these peaks tend to occur right after a major high point in the precipitation record. So here's one, here's another, there's another one there, another one there. In fact, they tend to be right after, a year later, after these peaks. So if you just now consolidate that down and say, I'm just going to look at the 5 years before and the 5 years after, this is what you get. So here's our fire year. This is year 0, and this is 5 years before and 5 years after. Again, to remind you, below 1 is drier and above 1 is wetter. What you see is indeed you have 2 to 3 years of above average precipitation before the fire event. And this is for all 9,500 wildfires. It's amazing it holds up so well. So we were curious, well, that may be driven by these very large fire events. And if you look in the dendrochronological records, fire scar records, they often talk about these large fire events showing up. And so we thought that maybe that when you have a lot of acres burned, that what was driving it. So we broke it apart looking at large fires versus small fires, again at that 1,000-acre break point. And you actually see the same pattern. The one difference is that the large fires tend to have even more precipitation, so perhaps a higher buildup of herbaceous biomass leading up to that fire, which maybe allows them to grow larger or spread across larger areas. But they both have above average precipitation for 3 years before, and they have this decline at the fire year. But the other thing that's interesting is that decline is not a drought decline. It's just going back to normal. In fact, with these data, it's not even going back to normal. It's slightly above average. So these aren't like the year of the fire doesn't have to be a severe drought. It just has to be on decline, coming down off of this high plateau. So then we were curious, well, we know that the majority of these fires are happening in Sagebrush Steppe. That's what I showed you earlier. So we broke it apart by potential vegetation type. And what you see here is the green line is Sagebrush Steppe. That's over 4,000 fires. Juniper, 2,500 fires is brown. And those really overlap nicely. The one that's different is Salt Desert Scrub, which only had a little over 900 fires. And what you see in Salt Desert Scrub is the Salt Desert Scrub environment tends to require a lot more precipitation resulting in a fire year, and that makes sense. If these are particularly fuel-limited systems, you need a really big precipitation event to generate enough biomass to burn, and that's what you see here. So salt desert scrub goes high, and then it comes down as well, following the same pattern. So I'd like to focus then on this idea of how much change in precipitation before to after is important. And this is important not only in terms of what is needed to generate the fire, but also later in the talk when I talk about post-fire restoration. And so the decline we see from 1 year before the fire to 1 year after the fire is about 10%, 9.9% is the difference in precipitation before to after. You can look at that averaged across 2 years before and 2 years after, and it's similar, 8.6, or 3 years down to about 7.9%. If you plot that, so now this is looking at year before, year after, 2 years before, 2 years after, 3 years before, 3 years after average, and you can see that there's a slightly declining function because these are averages, right? So you're losing some of that magnitude of change, but still there's quite a difference. We then wanted to compare that to those same exact locations, so the same centroid in each fire, but not centered on fire year, centered on every other year in the 65-year period. And that's what you get. There's no pattern. It doesn't drop. It's hovering right at zero if you look at that difference. So what is the evidence that precipitation is driving biomass? Well, I think anyone that works out in these landscapes would say, yeah, that's just what happens. And so we looked at a long-term data set. This is from southwestern Idaho, shared to us for 2 sites, and in green and in gray. And then precipitation is overlaid in this blue bar, okay? So this is from 1990 to 2014. How much did precipitation vary and how much did exotic herbaceous biomass vary in this landscape? And you say, pretty strong correlation there, right? And so we thought, well, maybe this is just because this is a southwestern Idaho site. It's low precipitation. It's driven by cheatgrass, which is what we're showing here. What if you look at the natives? So this is that same data set, but just looking at native herbaceous cover now, and you get a similar correlation, not as strong. And the other thing you notice is that the natives don't seem to respond quite as strongly to precipitation, but it's certainly still there. So you have a combination of native and non-native herbaceous biomass responding to this precipitation event. Well, so in conclusion of this first hypothesis, wildfires are more likely after several years of above average precipitation, followed by a drop to normal or below normal precipitation. There seems to be a very strong pattern there. And this is not new. This is just contributing evidence, which I would now call overwhelming evidence, that in arid lands, precipitation 1 to 2 years prior to a fire really determines this area burned concept. And Paul Knapp was talking about this in 1990s, a couple papers here, and Little wrote a paper that was interesting and did some analyses and focusing on these arid lands here, which are indicated by brown and by purple, and found that if you look at temperature, didn't matter. If you look at drought, PSDI, didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was prior precipitation in terms of wildfire area burned. Okay, so moving on. Now, the second question we were asking is what are the outcomes of post-fire seedings? And so what we did is we compiled all of the post-fire seeding data that we could find. And this is a project that USGS and BLM has been working on for several years. It's called the Land Treatment Digital Library. And this is the number of post-fire seedings in the Great Basin. This was back in February. It's actually quite a bit larger than that now. But the number of treatments shown from 1940 to 2010. So a whole lot of seeding has gone on. About 5,500 seedings have taken place in this landscape, all after fire in either a emergency stabilization or rehabilitation context. So we take those data, it turns out that there's a variable amount of information for each project because of variation in record keeping at the field office level. And so if you drill down, you can see that some places we have just plans. We're not really sure if that was implemented. Others we know, yes, there's documentation. This was an implemented project. And some of those have seed lists, very detailed seed lists. And some of those actually report the outcome as a success. In fact, they report it either as partially successful, fully successful, or failure. And so we have about 800 that fall into that category. And I just want to take a second to show you what BLM means when they're talking about this. So here's what a description of a successful treatment is. Monitoring indicated that there were 6 perennial plants per square meter as of June of 2007. Crested wheatgrass was the primary grass found in the monitoring plots, but bottlebrush squirreltail, prairie June grass, and Sandberg's bluegrass were also common in the plots. Bladderpot, astragalus, and prairie lupin were the dominant forbs. Grass cover averaged 5% and perennial forb cover 3%. Annual forb and cheek cover were less than 1%, but this could be due to dry winter and spring in 2007. Seedlings of grasses were common throughout the seeding. There were also a number of grass plants that survived the fire. So that's a description of fire. You can see that it's focusing on some quantitative metrics. And BLM has moved a little bit away from this idea of categorizing things as successful or failure, but it turns out that this is powerful information, and I wish that was not the case. That I think this type of description and classification has a lot more merit than folks are giving credit for. I'll show you what a failure is written as. Poor to fair germination of the drill-seeded species. Overall, the density of seeded grass plants was still below established quantitative objectives. There were no seeded forbs documented in the plots. Annual exotic vegetation continues, so obviously it was beforehand, to dominate the area. A minimal amount of seeded grass species, crested wheatgrass, were found in the plot based on the extreme cover of annual exotic vegetation on the plot and very low density of seeded species. The seeding will be considered a failure. So these classifications of success, partially successful, and failure were not anything that we came up with as a research team. These were designated by the field office at the time of the treatment, actually within 3 years of monitoring the treatment. So what we're going to do now is focus on this tail out here of post-fire. What's going on out here in the post-fire environment in terms of precipitation? And we're going to focus in on the Sagebrush Steppe, which is this green line. So for the rest of the talk, I won't mention what's happening in these other vegetation types. And what you'll notice is that there is some variation around that line. It's tight, these are standard error bars, but there is variation. So it's not like that's a mean response, but realize that there's quite a bit of variability and what's driving that variability. So let's now look at the precipitation comparing successful treatments to failures. So these are places that BLM identified as successful in the green line and failures in the brown line. And what you see is after the fire, the successful treatments had more precipitation. They tended to hover around normal precipitation, where the failures were quite low, all right, dropping down here and stayed low for a couple years, coming up in the 3rd year, coming back to normal by the 4th year, and then kind of just overlapping with the successful ones, so no difference there. But there is a clear difference between a successful treatment and failure simply by looking at the differences in precipitation. You might be looking out here too and saying, well, why are the failures so much higher? Good question. Maybe there was more biomass there and it burned hotter. Those are some interesting questions. There's also a sample size issue here. Because we're only dealing with those in Sagebrush Steppe that were reported as failure or not failure, our sample sizes are smaller. So now let's look at the partial successful, which is overlapped in a dotted black line here. These are interesting. Partial successful stay high precipitation as before. They drop down and then they really mimic the failures. The only difference is in the 3rd year, they tend to rebound much stronger. So that 3rd year of monitoring that BLM's doing may be picking up some of the species that are finally germinating or at least covers restoring of some perennial grasses that are desirable. And so that seems to be the only difference between partial success and failure, is that in the 3rd year you get a bit of a rebound in precipitation. So we thought, well, maybe this is just an artifact of where these things are occurring. Maybe they're all being done in places where there's more effort being put into seeding or whatever. And so this is a map showing successful treatments in green, partial in blue, and failure in red. And you can see across the Great Basin, they're nicely distributed. You also see a whole lot of unknowns because there's a lot of seedings in the Great Basin where, for whatever reason, there was no success reported. And so we were curious, where do those fall? So we plotted those now in this blue line. These are all the unknowns, and look at the sample size. Sample size jumps way up to 2,500 seedings now. So this is a very large sample size, and it's kind of like you'd expect. It falls somewhere in the middle between successful and failure because it's probably a mix of successful and failure. We don't know what the outcome is. The other thing that's important to notice, though, is it is for 1, 2, 3 years below the normal precipitation. So when there's criticism of there's a whole lot of seeding failure out there, what's the deal? It may be that the precipitation patterns are predisposed to failure in some ways. Because the things that led up to this fire event and this drying continue down and have below average precipitation for several years after the fire, right when you're putting in the seed. The decision to seed is made right here as soon as 20 days or something like that to get the plans in, and then the seed gets on the ground somewhere in here, and then you just hope that it rains. And it looks like, for the most part, it tends to be drier than normal. So perhaps that's one explanation for why there's a lot of failure out there. Oops. Okay, so I want to just jump to a real-world example here. This is the soda fire, which you're maybe familiar with, that burned in southwestern Idaho and just along the Oregon border. This is taken across the city lights of Boise. And we broke out precipitation out of curiosity into spring precipitation and winter precipitation from 2007 to 15. Okay, so let's just focus on spring precipitation. And here's the fire in 2015. And if you remember the previous figures, you'd say, well, gee, shouldn't the fire be right here, right? You have 3 years of above average precipitation, and then it comes down, and that's where the fire should be. Realize those are average patterns, and they may deviate from that. So here's an example of deviation, but I bet this was still caused by that accumulation of biomass that just dried and was then thatched and was just sitting there waiting to burn, because that litter is going to stick around for a few years and be ready for fire. But what's more important is what's happening right here. The fire happened on this upswing at the end of that trough, and that could have really strong implications for the success of the seeding. And this is a high-profile seeding event that's going on, spotlight at the national level of we can do restoration in Sagebrush Steppe to protect sage grouse in particular. So we were curious, what is this upswing continuing? So this is the precipitation, cumulative monthly precipitation for 2015 in this dark blue, and then the average in this light blue. And so since May in Boise, we've been having above average precipitation. So this upswing is continuing, which is a good sign that perhaps there's going to be enough moisture available to allow better success of this seeding. It also implies that perhaps this idea that Mike Pellant mentioned, where you have there used to be a 2-year and a 3-year window of stabilization and rehabilitation. Now it's been shifted to 3 and 5, allowing for some more flexibility of when that seed goes in the ground, and perhaps reseeding through that 5-year window is important. So I don't want to end on a completely negative note, but realize that even if we are successful and can modify seeding strategies and timing of seeding to maximize success, we face some major challenges. And I'll just finish up with 2 slides here. And this is looking at seedings. We found that 42% of seeding treatments have reburned at least once since 1960. 42%. Of those that reburned, so of those 42%, 34% burned once, 20% burned twice, 16% 3 times, and so forth. So these areas, even if we are successful, have a high probability of reburning. That's a bit depressing. How long does it take for them to reburn? If you look at the time to reburn, we're finding about an average of 9.4 years for a seeding to have another fire come through. So in conclusion, we did find that precipitation sets up conditions for fire. We also found that precipitation patterns, the same precipitation patterns perhaps that resulted in that fire also tend to result in post-fire restoration failure. It's not an absolute, but that's what the trends show us. And some important implications of this are that I think there's an opportunity here to use precipitation data more carefully to assess fire risk. And I know that's done already, but perhaps there's new ways we could do it, knowing that if we see this pattern of 3 years of above average precipitation, be prepared to watch areas that are following that pattern. And we looked across different MLRAs and we looked across different decades to see if maybe this was a bias caused by one area of the Great Basin, and it wasn't. It was pretty much universal. The other implication here is that there's possible use of precipitation data to support decisions for the timing of post-fire seeding. And just to give an example of this, so here in the blue line is our annual precipitation that I've been showing you. But if you break that out by the winter precipitation, October to March, or the spring precipitation, May to June, there may be an opportunity here after the fire where you're tracking these trends and making a go, no-go decision about whether to put seed in the ground or not. And so those are perhaps some opportunities that we could tap into in the future. Thank you for listening.
Time for questions.
Yes, Jenny.
So in that last example, what would you recommend? Like as far as winter precip versus spring precip, what's the best? How do you use that to decide whether you're going to?
We're finding that spring precip is actually the best predictor. If you were to take windows of time, spring precipitation turns out to be the best predictor of the trend that's going. And so what we'd like to do is perhaps look at finer intervals. So if you were to, because I know there's decisions that have to be made in September, October, November, those are the critical times. And so it'd be, what we'd like to do is model that and say, can you have a better than 50-50 chance, which we've heard people say, it's the luck of the draw if it rains or not, right? Well, maybe not. Maybe the trends are strong enough that we could say, no, there's a 75% chance that it's going to continue to be dry. And we should wait and stabilize the soil some other way and hold off on that native seed until we can really take advantage of it. Yeah.
David, I know you have a lot of fires, but some of those fires are really large. So you guys used a single, or used the central rate to calculate precipitation for that site. But for example, a lot of fires, 2012 for example, 250,000 acres. Is it possible that you could see variation across that site? Could you potentially add more sample points? Or is it just too many fires to read into it?
Right, so the question was, you have a 200,000 acre fire and you're putting one centroid, infinitesimally small point on the ground. Right, those are great points. If you put more points into that polygon, you get accused of pseudoreplication. So it's a statistical issue. Yes, you could maybe stratify those points based on vegetation or something else. So there's ways we've thought about doing it. The patterns are so strong and so consistent, it doesn't seem to matter. So we're kind of like better to go with the safe route of not having pseudoreplication. Yeah.
One more quick question.
So there wasn't an effect of temperature on seeding success?
Well, I wouldn't answer it that way. So the question was, is there there was not an effect of temperature on seeding success. We have not evaluated temperature effects on seeding success yet. Yeah, so that's a good question. I think seeding success is complicated and influenced by soil and topography and all the other factors that go into it. And we're delving into that analysis now, and over the next couple of years we'll be focusing on that. Yeah, great question.
Maybe just one more.
One more question.
Based on the stuff that I've seen, the return interval for fires in a natural ecosystem is around 10 years. But return interval for cheatgrass dominated is 3 to 4 years. Does that match what you guys have seen? So if that's true, then what you just showed on that 9.5
No, that's a great point. So the question was, if you have if we're now saying with a cheatgrass fire cycle, we're in the 3-year realm of return intervals, 10 years is pretty good. Maybe if we're managing for grasslands, but if you're trying to get sagebrush back on the landscape and it takes 15 to 30 or more years to get sagebrush back healthy, then a 10-year cycle is just not going to cut it. So, but sure. Those are important questions that maybe it is improving the fire return interval, slowing it down a bit. And there is some evidence that seeding in certain environments certainly outcompetes cheatgrass in some cases, and that can make a big difference in fire return. Yeah.
We need to
Thank you.
take the break. So